Hello internet and welcome to the channel. My name is Frankie and in today's video we are going to be building a very special habitat for 3 different species in our Planet Zoo franchise mode zoo, Little Asia. When I was initially deciding what animals were going to be in this zoo, I did know of 3 species that were going to have to live in a much colder environment compared to the rest of the animals in this zoo. So with that in mind, I'm going to be building a habitat for the Japanese macaque, the red-crowned crane, or red-crested crane is what I knew it as before this game, and the snow leopard. Now, all 3 of these animals obviously need a very cold environment. They like a bit of snow. So what you can see me doing here is starting to create a kind of template that I'm going to copy and paste in order to make a large enclosed habitat for these animals. The idea is that they are going to be living indoors, somewhere that I can regulate the temperature a bit easier, or at least in the real world it would be easier to regulate the temperature indoors than in the open air. Having the habitat remain quite cold when it's just an open air habitat would be quite difficult, but enclosing it like this is going to make it a bit easier. So what I'm doing specifically is I am building a 4x4 kind of rectangle. As I say 4x4 rectangle, it's a tall rectangle made out of 4x4 pieces. This is going to serve as one section of wall. I'm going to decorate this how I see fit with various bits of wood and stuff. I'm not going to go crazy, just a little bit of decoration to make it look a little bit interesting. And then I'm going to have a roof that slants from this rectangle a few lengths inwards. And then I'm going to copy and paste the whole thing and attach it to the other side so that we are creating an archway, having basically the exact same thing copy and pasted opposite each other to create an archway. And then I can group that together, and by copy and pasting that and using the advanced move tools, I can twist on the spot to get them to line up with each panel. Doing this repeatedly allows me to create a large dome, and that is the basic premise for this habitat. Both enclosures, because they're not going to be living in the same thing. If you have snow leopards with monkeys, the monkeys are going to die, obviously. Both of the habitats are going to be within this big dome, because then it can regulate temperatures and stuff. So that is what I'm doing here. I am creating a large dome kind of area, and this technique can be used for any size building. Here I'm making it quite a bit bigger because I want to have 2 habitats in it. But if you wanted to have maybe a series of shops inside of a dome, or have all of your exhibit animals in there, then you can make this significantly smaller by just reducing how far the roof tiles go out from your original wall. Now, the reason that I'm making sure to add the timber beams to run up the side of the wall sections is because if I were to copy and paste this section just with plain wall pieces, it's going to look really boring and quite dull. But just by adding these simple wooden structures, you start to break it up a bit and have it be a much more interesting thing that you've built. Especially when it's copy and pasted, it's going to create a nice pattern almost. I'm also going to put a window up the top, and the reason for this is because once the building is complete, it's going to be awfully dark inside. So this will allow a small portion of natural light to come in. Alternatively, you could do the roof similar to how I've done it, where it's been made out of tiles at certain angles and just lined up, but you could instead make it from glass panels. There are plenty of glass options for roofing tiles, so you can kind of achieve what I've achieved here with glass as well. If you don't want to install windows, you can have loads of natural light by just having a glass roof instead. I've also used some East Asia decorations, just again to help break up the wall structure a little bit so that it's less boring, less flat looking, and it just helps bring a little bit of life to this building because it's such a big thing in the zoo. It takes up quite a lot of area. Looking at it from a distance or even up close, I guess, it's going to look really boring if you're not adding just these little finishing touches here and there to give it a bit of life. Once the basic building is complete, and I must say I'm actually quite happy with how this has turned out, you can see it didn't meet up entirely correctly and I just had to make some alterations on a very small part of it. But once it is complete, I can start to delete some wall sections to allow for ways for our visitors and our keepers to actually get in. For this particular building, I already had it in mind that I would have an elevated walkway. Just like we did with the tapir house, where you could walk straight into the habitat house, we are going to have a pathway that kind of twists and winds its way straight through this dome, which means that our visitors and our guests are only going to be seeing the animals from above, which is a pretty unique perspective to enable your viewers to actually have, which is just, I think it's pretty cool. It breaks up the way that your visitors are experiencing your zoo. So far all of them have been on the ground when you're seeing your animals. This allows just a different way of looking at your animals. So in order to enable that, I'm going to be deleting one of the wall sections around halfway up the building, and then I'm going to use the pathing tools to get a path up to the correct height and kind of work its way through the hole that we've made. I'm also going to make a couple of adjustments with the glass and stuff. I'm going to make a bit more of a feature window above the archway for the guests to come through. Just want to spruce this bit up a little bit to make it look a tiny bit more like an actual entrance for our visitors. Now, I could rather easily just turn on the angle snap for our pathing and make a nice straight line straight through the centre of this dome. But if you've been watching the series so far, you may have noticed that I quite like to have organic feelings to the enclosures, and that is mirrored in the pathing system. I know I haven't exactly shown much of what I've been doing outside of the enclosures in this zoo, but I will make sure to show you a bit more of that in an upcoming video. So I mirror that organic sense when it comes to adding this path inside and have it proper snake its way through the dome. I even double back on myself to create kind of a loop in the pathing system just to add a bit more interest and to allow a bit more space, because this is quite a tight area. We want our guests to be able to move about quite a bit, so I create kind of a second path for people to walk out on, even though it kind of leads to the same point. It's just an extra option and it makes the whole thing look a little bit more interesting. When the path reaches the other side of the dome, I just need to repeat what I did with the archway on the other side, and I actually just copy and paste that section entirely and then delete the necessary parts on the side that I'm adding it to, just so that we have somewhere to have our path point back out of the building for later on. Whenever we decide we're going to build past this point in the zoo, the guests will be able to descend out the other side of this dome. When it comes to adding the barriers for this enclosure, I'm going to have it be a plain concrete wall and have it be the height so that it goes directly underneath the path. Make sure the height is as close to the path as possible, and then snake the barrier along underneath the path to try and mirror it as much as I can, therefore hiding the actual barrier from our visitors from above. They won't be able to see it because they are on it, which just, it kind of suggests that this is a really open and free space. It kind of tricks your guests into thinking that it is completely open and free roaming, which is great. And once the concrete barriers are in place, I can use null barriers to go around the outside of the dome just to make sure these enclosures are fully fledged working enclosures. And then I can add the habitat doors to the front of this dome where the keepers will be able to get in. And we're ready to actually start making these enclosures into things for the animals to live in. As I mentioned earlier, this dome is going to be quite dark due to the lack of natural light. So with that in mind, I decided to grab some lanterns or lampposts from the East Asia pack and line the pathways that the guests are going to be walking on, line the edges of those with our lampposts. This is going to allow a little bit of light in here, a little bit of extra light, but also I think these lampposts will look lovely in a snowy environment, which is what this dome is eventually going to be. So I think it's quite fitting with the theme. Now the first half of the dome that I'm going to start altering is the one that is going to be housing the Japanese macaque and the red-crowned crane. One thing that I know about the Japanese macaque is, like all of the primates in this game, they're going to need to be able to climb. So with that in mind, I start to raise the back of this enclosure area to start to add a bit of verticality to it. with this being such a kind of uniform shape, I don't want the enclosure itself to be uniform by any means, because it's just going to be quite boring. So adding these different heights and shapes to the terrain is really going to make a big difference. Oftentimes when I think of the Japanese macaque, I think of them bathing in the hot springs in Japan. I know that this is a very select few that actually do this, but it is the thing that comes to mind the most. So what I'm going to do is at the top of this hilled area, I'm going to make a small dip and then fill it with water, then surround it with stones as if though it is kind of a hot spring, which I don't know, I just think it's quite funny. It is also going to be essential that I have some coolers in this enclosure, and for that fact in the Snow Leopard enclosure as well. So I'm just going to litter these about. I'm going to keep them under the ground so that they're not visible to the guests or to us, because I don't think they look very nice. But it will still get the job done. It will still keep these enclosures nice and cold, which is perfect for the animals that are going to be going in here. Once our macaque arrives, we can start to alter the terrain in terms of the texture that's going to be on the ground, and that is predominantly snow. Now, I would have ideally had the red-crowned crane in here at the same time, but these animals are a little bit harder to come by when it comes to the animal market, so I wasn't able to get them at the same time as the macaque. So all the alterations done right here are with basically only meeting the needs of the macaque, which is fine because not too different to the red-crowned crane, but when it eventually does come in, I'm going to need to add a bit more grass and stuff. And speaking of grass, we're going to now hop over to the environment tab and start selecting some plants that is going to be suitable for these animals. As I mentioned earlier, I want to have some big rocks around the pool at the top of this hill, and I did play about with these moss kind of rocks, but I couldn't quite figure out how I would use them in a way that would look good. They just look a bit too, I don't know, forced in my opinion. There's obviously going to be a way of using them properly, and I'm going to experiment a bit with it because I do like the idea of these bright green rocks. But without using those, I just went ahead and used one of my favourite plants for covering a cold environment, and that is caribou moss. I think it's always quite good to have a staple plant that is quite large that you can use to cover a large surface area quite quickly to just boost up the plant coverage needs, and then you can start to make it look pretty with your accent plants that you want in the enclosure that are going to make it look really pretty with like bright colours and stuff. And whilst I was getting on with adding all these plants, I also knew that I had some of the enrichment items unlocked for the macaque due to some research on lemurs that I'd done in a previous zoo. So I had already unlocked quite a few things that I could add to this enclosure in terms of enrichment. So to begin with, we added a few climbing frames, as we can then start to add smaller enrichment items around them. And similarly to the macaque, I had already unlocked some of the enrichment items for the crane due to the research we had done on the flamingos earlier in this zoo. So I was able to add the big water fountain thing for them and a few sprinklers, but the rest are going to have to be done when they arrive so we can get researching those animals. Once the animals were in, guests started coming into this dome immediately, so I wanted to make sure that we had some of my custom education boards in place so that the guests actually learnt stuff about these animals, and I also needed to place down the donation bins so that they were also earning us a little bit of money for their upkeep. Next, it was over to the other half of the dome to work on the Snow Leopard enclosure. I started similarly to the last enclosure with a bit of terrain alteration. I just want to add a bit of verticality again, make it look a bit more interesting. So I do exactly what I did last time and raise a section at the back. I'm not going to play about too much with the terrain this time though, as I want to add some quite large animal climbing frames, which are going to kind of be the main source of height variation in this enclosure anyway. One small thing that I did need to keep an eye on is where I was raising the terrain. I was also raising some of the terrain outside of the dome and it was poking through the wall. So to make sure there wasn't this weird grassy verge poking out the wall of this dome meters up in the air, I went outside and just started to use the push tool to make it go back inside so that it wasn't poking out through the wall, because it did look a bit strange. With the terrain alterations done, it was time to pick some of the large climbing frames for these big cats and add them to the enclosure. I wanted to make sure they weren't too close to where the walkway was, because I know that the top of the barrier on the raised walkways in this case is spiky, but I don't know if the animals can still jump from their climbing frame onto the path. And that would obviously be a problem, so I need to make sure it's not too close. I opt for this really cool wooden one, and then another one that is built into some rocks, which I think is great because it's instantly going to add a bit of texture and a bit more variety to this environment, which so far is just grassy slopes. Once the enrichment items are in terms of climbing, I start to add some of the toys and food enrichment, and rather appropriately, the frozen blood pumpkin is the first one, which is great for a frozen dome kind of place. So yeah, that makes sense. I also added the pinata, the pronghorn and the zebra. I know these animals are probably never going to come across these in the wild, but you know, it's kind of funny to add these things anyway. I also then add some of the toy enrichment items, and there's not much more I can do until the animals are here, which they actually already are, but I'm just focusing on the enrichment for right now. And then I'm going to do all the terrain alterations and the plants. Just like in the other habitat inside this dome, the main texture needed for the ground is snow. That is unsurprising, of course it is, but something that I wasn't expecting is that these animals don't want basically any plants. The coverage is really low, so that presented itself like it was quite a unique challenge for me. The way I've been building enclosures so far is to pack them full of plants and foliage. I think adding that just makes enclosures look so much nicer. So really having to restrict myself with adding plants was quite a challenge that I kind of welcomed. It was nice to mix up what I was doing for a change, and it presented a challenge because I had to somehow make it look nice without relying on plants too much. So that was something that I had to do. That it ended up looking okay, I think. I relied a bit more on flowers and like smaller shrubs rather than large trees. And once the few plants that I could place in here were placed, it was actually done. And now it's time to look at how these two enclosures look once finished. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. It was so much fun to work in a different biome for a change, because this zoo so far has been quite tropical. So if you did enjoy it, maybe consider giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this appearing in your subscription feed. It is free after all, and it makes me feel like I have friends. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later. This one is